Greetings, Cornerstone Church. This is Pastor Daniel. We're starting a brand new online Bible study today. Our last one that we just finished up a couple of weeks ago was on Esther. One of the things I enjoyed about Esther is we're right here in the middle of a pandemic in 2020. A lot of things are not going our way. There's so much trouble and turmoil. It really feels similar to the situation that the Israelites were in during the time of some of the exiles. In other words, there aren't as many good things happening as seemingly bad things, and we might sit around and wonder where in the middle of all of that is God. And in the book of Esther, the word God is not mentioned, and God is not necessarily assigned a role in it as we read it. But if you do read the book, you'll see the underlying hand of God to keep His people, protect His people, and guide them. And so we really got a good lesson out of that, that in the midst of times when we don't necessarily see the hand of God doing good things for us around us, maybe we have a tendency to look at the things that aren't not going well. God is still at work and active and doing well by us. And so if you want to go watch those, they're on our YouTube channel where you find this video. So just look around and you'll see those. There are 5 installments of that for 5 weeks, about 20-25 minutes each. So if you're looking for a Bible study to do, that would be a good one. So today we're moving on and we'll be working in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is part of the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. And what we see in Ecclesiastes is we find a book that if we just read it for what it is, we might ask a lot of questions. Well, why would God include Ecclesiastes in the Bible? And what we find is it is part of a larger body of literature, the wisdom literature in the Bible. Specifically, when we say wisdom literature, I'm referring to Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. And really, Ecclesiastes works best when you read all 3 of those together. And we'll talk about why that is. So what is wisdom literature? We back up to the beginning. I'm a big picture person. Let's start at the top. Wisdom, if we're pursuing in a biblical sense, is to learn how to live well in this life. Making good decisions, behaving well, doing what we ought to be doing, when we ought to be doing, why we ought to be doing it. All of those things. But in many ways, wisdom is how to live smoothly in life instead of kind of living against God's grain, if that makes sense. So we want to go with the grain of God instead of against. And that would make sense if you have carpet and you push it one way and it's with the grain, and you push it the other way and the grain stands up. Or perhaps petting a cat backwards. If you go with the hair, it's great. If you go back the other way, not so much. And so wisdom is how do we live with the grain of God? And the central theme through all these books is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So fear not in a sense of being afraid of God, but fear in a sense of giving God the respect of being God. And meanwhile, we're not pretending or trying to be God. Adam and Eve's fault is they wanted to be as God. They wanted to think as God, see as God, and they made the wrong decisions. And so wisdom is us saying, okay, God, we'll let you be God. And what we'll do is just be the faithful follower. Faithful follower I would be. And if we do it that way, then God will take care of us. And we know that to be a biblical fact. So Proverbs, if we start there, is perhaps the easiest to read. And I would say Proverbs are quick answers to life's problems that are generally true. It is generally true that if you live a righteous life and you do all the right things, good things will happen. God will take care of you. So if you save money, you'll have more money in the end. But that, we live in a fallen world. We live in the world as a result of Adam and Eve, where creation suffers, where we have sin and death and things like that. And that doesn't always work out the way we want. And I think Proverbs is not saying it's always going to work out. Proverbs is saying, as a general rule, live your life in the right way. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart. But it's not a promise in the sense that God is saying, if you do A, B, C, and D, then I'll do E, because that's not necessarily the way that is meant to be. A lot of us would read it that way. And again, there we're talking about wisdom literature. We're talking about wise things that lead us to the right point along the way. And so a lot of people have struggled with that. If you have struggled with that, I'm sorry. But really what we're saying is Proverbs, not that they're not always true, but that it's meant to be a general statement that's usually true. That's the whole point of a proverb. What does the book of Ecclesiastes add to that? The book of Ecclesiastes says, that doesn't always work out. It is the opposite side. It is the anti-proverb. It is train up your child in the way they should go, and sometimes they choose drugs over the right life. That's harsh. But I know many parents who say, where did I go wrong? And sometimes we have to just admit we raise children to make their own choices, and they do. You could save all your money, and what happens, right? Then the stock market crashes. So you save money. A penny saved is not always a penny earned. In general, if you save a penny, you'll have a penny. But sometimes you save it, you put it in the stock market at the right time, it dives, you lost that penny. Better to have bought something with it, right? But not in general. In general, you want to save some money. Spend some money, enjoy it. Save some money, enjoy it. Give some money to God, enjoy that. But so we realize that those aren't always true, and Ecclesiastes adds a bit of point of cynicism, sarcasm. Hey, we're not naive anymore. We know that this is a mean world that we live in. And so the Ecclesiastes would then question the meaning of life. If sometimes things are random and of chance, how do we know what's going on? Do we know what's going on? Or are we just meant to wake up, work, and die? That's a good question from Ecclesiastes. And then if you put Job into perspective, Job is in many ways I see it as an object lesson describing Proverbs versus Ecclesiastes. In that, for Job, if Proverbs says something along the lines of if you want to sow good things, if you want to reap good things, sow good things. Job says sometimes you sow good things. In other words, God called Job righteous. And yet then he turned around and allowed Satan, the opposer, to come along and bring havoc into his life. Job did not deserve that. And so that it seems like maybe it goes against Proverbs, but really it's an exception to Proverbs. Really it is that sometimes there's a higher understanding of what's going on right now in your life. And if God's involved in that, that's okay. You can still, if you have God but nothing else, you're okay. Ecclesiastes also adds a little bit of element to that. That's anti-Job, even though it is kind of the Job mentality. In Ecclesiastes, the person who writes it claims to be the wealthiest person to that point, the wisest person to that point. The way it starts off, it's really trying to convince us that it's Solomon who writes this. Although we see a lot of the things that he talks about probably describing something later than Solomon. Because things were going rather well with Solomon. And why would Solomon then turn around and say, oh, life is meaningless, or a vapor in the wind? And so what Ecclesiastes says is, hey, I went out and looked and found all the knowledge. I've got all of the understanding and wisdom. I've got all these riches, and they're meaningless. And I think the point of that, especially if you read the last chapter, is they're meaningless without God. So in that way, Proverbs is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's great. Yes. Job, the fear of the Lord, even in the midst of difficulty, is the beginning of wisdom. And then Ecclesiastes, you can search all day for wisdom, but if it's not founded in God, it's really not wisdom in the first place. But you're not going to be there. So all three of these are let God be God. Proverbs, let God be God and live a righteous life according to his desires. Ecclesiastes, live a godly life, and sometimes bad things are going to happen to you, and the meaning of that may be obscured. It may seem like chance, but it's not. So find God, and then that's what it says at the end of the book. Again, go back to wisdom. Go back to Proverbs. It's okay to question and wonder what's going on, but then go back to Proverbs. Live your righteous life. Job, even if everything is taken away from you, live a righteous life. Fear God. Don't curse God and die. And so all three of those kind of share the same way of looking at wisdom from a different perspective. And so to read only Proverbs will benefit you greatly because you'll be living a righteous life, but also you'll be short-sighted because if something negative comes along and you don't have the being tempered by reading Job and understanding Ecclesiastes, the loss of hope, the loss of meaning, you might fall down and not get back up. You might leave the church. You might say, well, God's not faithful after all. Thought he was, but he's not. And in reality, God is faithful in all those, but we just have to see it from a different perspective. And so Ecclesiastes, Job, in the right place with Proverbs, leading that righteous life, are the way to find wisdom, and wisdom is God. Wisdom is not created by God. Wisdom is God. It is the right order of everything. And so reading all of those will point us to God and cause us to be more faithful. So let's dive into that. Before we do that, there's a couple of ways that I would categorize, maybe read the same statement several different ways and look at it. If Proverbs is we reap what we sow, Job is sometimes we reap what we didn't sow. Ecclesiastes, kind of depressing. We're going to spend all of our life reaping and sowing and then die, which is so depressing. But he's saying, look for the meaning in that. You won't find it if chance is real. And then again at the end, the whole point. So what Ecclesiastes allows us to do is throw that temporary pity party, questions and things, but come out at the right place at the end anyway. Here you go. Proverbs, do the right thing if you want good things to happen. Job, you can do the right thing and still have bad things happen, which did. Ecclesiastes, whatever you do, you're going to die at the end of that and give an account to God. So Ecclesiastes, from that point of view, is fascinating. So what I thought we'd do today, we give a little bit of introduction to where do we see that the book of Ecclesiastes in the whole Bible. It's in the wisdom literature. It is hugely poetic and meant to help us find meaning in life and purpose in life and understand that. We see that it is one part of 3 units. Some people put Song of Solomon and Psalms maybe to an extent in that, but they're really poetry. And as poetry, all 3 of the books we're talking about today are poetic. So all of these books fit within poetry, but not all poetry would be wisdom literature. So poetry, you could include Song of Solomon, Psalms, Proverbs to an extent, but certainly Job and Ecclesiastes are full of poetry. Dense Hebrew poetry, which sometimes makes them hard to read. And we'll just be honest with that going into it. It's not a gospel narrative. And then, but the three books that we need to fit into perspective are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And so we'll reference that throughout those 3 books as we talk about it. But to dive into the book of Ecclesiastes, I want to spend a little bit of time today in chapter 1. We'll spend most of the time talking about the first 3 or 4 chapters and then the last chapter. And we'll do that over the next several weeks. 1 chapter a day, and then we'll reference some of the stuff that happens in the middle, but that's where it dives into some of the deep poetry. And then we'll talk about what meaning we find at the end of that. So we're going to start in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1. And we see the author identified not as a name, but as a title. And I'll share with you a little bit why that's interesting. In the ESV, which is what I read and what you'll read here in a minute, it says the words of the preacher. A lot of other versions say the words of the teacher. And the idea, Ecclesiastes, is a Greek word related to the word church. You might hear of ecclesiastical or something like that. It really is assembly. It is the word in the New Testament describing the church. The church is not a building. The church is the assembly of Christians, those who are disciples and followers of Jesus Christ. And so this is Ecclesiastes, a word related to that assembly. In Hebrew, it would have been koholeth, and that's the word that's used. Our title is a Greek transliteration. We say out the way they would have said it in Greek. But koholeth. And so koholeth is related again to the assembly. And so we think that the title of this person is the person who speaks to the assembly. So this person has a message that he thinks is very much needed. And what we see is probably the way the book is written there in a time with no hope. Again, it's trying to tell us when it says it's the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. It really could have been any son of David because Joseph and Jesus are both the son of David. It is a descendant of David term. But it could have actually been the son of David. It could be Solomon. He says at one point he's the wisest of the wise up to that point. And we don't know of anybody surpassing Solomon. It says the richest of the rich. We don't know anybody surpassing, especially not of the kings of Israel, because they faded quickly after Solomon. It could very well be the book was written during a later time. It would have been very acceptable during this time for somebody to say, I'm writing a part 2 to Solomon's work. And as such, I'm going to be part 2, Solomon part 2, as the author. As the person who's speaking, but it could have been somebody else speaking for Solomon. It was not unheard of to have, if you had a teacher who wrote a book and you wrote a book that leaned on their understanding to sign it as them, not you. And today we would never do that. Today we only give to the person credit for what they actually wrote, and if a student wrote it, we give the credit to the student. There, it would have been a high honor to write and author something as your teacher. And so it's very possible that that happened. What we know is a lot of the things that they dealt with during this time doesn't seem like Solomon dealt with. Solomon, being so rich and happy, had a lot more going for him. But either way, Solomon could have written the whole thing. We do have two voices in Ecclesiastes. We have the teacher, the preacher, who is telling us all this stuff, but then the one who wrote it down, the one who actually wrote all the things down and wrote the final chapter, much of it, is the author. So we'll have the teacher and the author, or the preacher, as it says. This is the person with the message that they're giving, who comes across to us one way or the other as Solomon. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What is that word? The best way of expressing that word is vapor, smoke, breath. Something that's here today, gone tomorrow. Something that you might see if you see smoke coming off of a fire. It makes a little quickly and then it's gone, and you wonder. Smoke has the effect of confusing. Smoke, vapor, wind. You feel the wind blowing on you on a hot day, and it came from this direction, it's headed to another direction, but you don't know where it started. You don't know where it's going to end up. Where does wind come from? And so in that way, it lends a certain amount of meaningless to it. Not that it doesn't have meaning. The wind accomplishes something. It blows, it moves, it has its effect, and then it ends up somewhere. It's just that we don't know where. The author John, I believe, in his gospel said the wind blows where it wants to, and you hear the sound of it, but you don't know where it's coming from or where it goes. So is the Spirit. And so it's that kind of thing. It's something less known. So when he says vanity or meaningless or something like that, you could think of it being temporary, like a soap bubble. It floats up and then you poke it and it's gone. But also something confusing, something that we don't understand, but not necessarily something entirely meaningless. Just that the meaning is obscured or cloudy or foggy in that way. So when he says all is vanity, he's trying to get us to a place of worst case scenario and then bring us back. So what he says is no life has meaning. Well, of course we know as Christians life has meaning in Jesus Christ. We're redeemed of our sins. We're headed for eternal life. Life has meaning. What he's trying to say is jump with me in this story, and I'm going to take you into some situations where it seems meaningless. And in the midst of that journey, as we're going through it, we'll find meaning, okay? But he starts off by saying something grabbed our attention. Life is meaningless. We know not necessarily true, but let's go with him on this journey. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? The term there, under the sun, very common in Ecclesiastes 30 to 40 times. And what he means by that is everything that has been created, everything under the sun, everything that exists here. In a minute he'll say there's nothing new under the sun. So it is the things that are here. But we work, and what do we get out of that? In other words, work is our way of controlling. We want a certain outcome, so we work towards it. But what does it accomplish? Control is an interesting issue. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom means giving God control instead of us. That's what Adam and Eve failed to do. They wanted to control things as God and could not give up that control. Proverbs essentially says that you can control good things happening to you by doing good things now. So if you live a righteous life, good things will come back. That's our way of controlling. In many ways, Ecclesiastes just says give up on that. You're not going to be able to control it because we don't know what God is thinking. In the story of Job, God has this conversation with the opposer, with Satan, and Job doesn't know that. So the idea that Job could have controlled that situation is laughable. And so what we need to do is give up control. And the analogy for that is work, us trying to accomplish something. And he says, so we spend all of our lives working at what we're doing under the sun. What have we gained for that? And this is kind of depressing because one of the major themes is death and dying and sin and bad things. But he says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. That means we wake up, we die. The world doesn't remember the people who lived, for the most part, several hundred years ago. You could name maybe a dozen or two, but certainly not billions who were alive that time. What about a generation or 3 or 4 from now? Will people remember us? That's why you see, I think, this control thing, a lot of people who are successful try to get something named after them, building on a college campus or something, so that they'll be remembered. And in reality, we remember a name. We don't necessarily remember the person because we can't. We didn't know them. We might learn some facts about them. So he says this. He goes on. He's even more depressing. A generation comes, a generation goes. The earth remains forever. Then he says, the sun rises and the sun goes down, and it hastens to the place where it rises. It's this cycle of life. We get up, we work, we eat, we go back to bed. The sun rises, it goes down, it goes back to the place where it rises. 6, the wind blows to the south, goes around to the north, around and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. So the wind is going to blow in the same direction tomorrow it blew today. How did the wind that went that way turn around, come back, and come this way again? It's just a cycle of nature. Here's another cycle in verse 7. All the streams run to the sea, but the sea's never full. To the place where the stream flows, they will flow again. So all this water goes back down the river into the sea, and then yet tomorrow there's a full slate of river to the sea water again, and the sea never fills up. What happens? Well, of course, we could talk about evaporating and all the wind, water being in the atmosphere, and then it raining and snowing up on the mountain, and then the streams being fed. We could talk about all those different things, but he says is the cycle's going to happen. What do you and I have to say about the cycles? Verse 8, all things are full of weariness, so much that man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, the ear filled with hearing. How many of you went to the beach one time and you thought, I've seen enough waves? Or how many of you think, I need to go back next year, or I'd rather go back next week, or I'd rather not leave, because to look out over the ocean and to watch the waves is a beautiful thing. But what he says is you'll never, ever be satisfied with watching something beautiful. You wake up one day to watch the sunrise. You say, it's so beautiful, I never need to see another sunrise. That's not what we say. We say something beautiful, we need to watch it again. And he says, so we're never satisfied. The ocean's never full. No matter what we do, it's never enough. We've not worked enough that work is done. Even if we retire from a job, there's work at the house. Even if we retire from a house and we go to live with somebody else, there's work involved in keeping ourselves up. We work, and that's the way it feels sometimes. So this is what it says. What has been is what will be. And what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. It's kind of cynical to say, not much way we can change it. The things that have been done, they're going to keep being done. You feed a homeless person, there'll be another homeless person tomorrow. We do something good for somebody, there'll be more opportunities to do something good for somebody tomorrow. And we could get cynical and stop in the middle of that and say, well, I guess there's no meaning to any of that, so let's quit. What about if we evangelized somebody and brought them into the church, they became a Christian, we were going to see them in heaven one day, glory, hallelujah, right? Wouldn't we want to do that again? Until when? The new people being born every day don't know Jesus. People dying every day don't know Jesus. Don't we have this insatiable appetite to see people come to him? When is it ever going to be done? And he keeps saying there's nothing new. It's just the same thing over and over again. So what is it that we want to accomplish? Where really is it that we find our place? In verse 10, is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. And here's the really sad part. There's no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to come among those who come after. So people aren't going to remember us. We don't remember the ones before us, very few exceptions. What does it say? Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it, and that's just the way life is going to go. Almost in a sense of, I don't know if any of you watched the Bill Murray movie, Groundhog Day. He woke up, he lived his life that day, went on, and every day he tried new things because he kept having a new opportunity to live the same day. And he groaned on in sorrow because he was kind of stuck in this reality. We are too, but every day we get a day older, and our day does not look exactly the same, but every day we get a new opportunity to affect our lives in some way. And what he's saying is, sometimes it doesn't seem to add up. Sometimes we see bad things happening to good people and we can't figure it out. Sometimes we see good things happening to bad people, and that's sometimes worse than bad things happening to good people. So where do we go from here? He says in verse 12, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. And I applied my heart to seek and search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. So he applied himself to learn the business of wisdom. And then he says it's an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and a striving after the wind. In other words, our efforts to control things. That's what he's talking about when he talks about work. Our effort to affect our lives in some way, to have control, whether it be to make a better tomorrow for ourselves, for our children, whatever it is that we want, is like chasing after wind to tell it where to go. We don't have as much control as we think we ought to have. And so in that way, we don't know the meaning of life. And I think the where we'll get, and so don't lose heart, because reading the first few chapters is tough. Especially if you're in a bad place. If you're throwing yourself a pity party, reading these might just be, it's meaningless, pointless. But we get to the end of the book, and it is just, the point is not to try to control. The point is to enjoy the day, enjoy the journey, enjoy the work, enjoy the striving. And so, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So he says, what's crooked cannot be made straight. Again, it's not up to us to make things straight. If God has them as crooked, they might often be crooked. What is lacking cannot be counted. So verse 16, I said in my heart, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. That's what we think Solomon. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. I applied my heart. This is him asserting his effort. His work was finding wisdom, and he says work is meaningless. I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly, and I perceive that also is but a striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases in sorrow. And so what he says is that life is hard and then you die. It's kind of cynical and pessimistic, but we're going to get somewhere. So if you're the kind of person who, maybe things aren't going so well, and you want to read somebody who agrees with you that sometimes life doesn't make sense, start reading Ecclesiastes. But protect your heart as you go through it. Don't be convinced of the skeptic, the teacher who's trying to teach, because the lesson is in there. We just have to get to the right point to see it. And so what he'll say, I think at the end is, therefore, stop striving. Stop working on your own. Stop trying to control your own fate. That's a God thing. Let God be God. The fear of the Lord, letting God be God in reverence and awe, not fearful of God, but respectful of God as God. That's the beginning of what we need to learn to live right in this world. And that's the goal. So we want to learn how to live well, live right in this world. And understanding that sometimes things don't work out the way we want, that God's ways are often higher than ours, is an important lesson. So we'll live there for a week, and I'll see you back next week, and we'll keep working through the book of Ecclesiastes. God bless you. I miss you. I hope to see you again soon in person. Maybe one day we'll do a Bible study in person again like we used to do. But for now, here we are, and we'll make the best of this.